Imagine a mighty empire where power and glory are held in the hands of an unbeatable king. But it is his arrogance that leads to a terrifying punishment, transforming him from a ruler of the world into a wild beast in a maddened frenzy. What could cause a man who once held the world to be reduced to this? A warning from God? Or had he lost himself in his own self-importance? The transformation of King Nebuchadnezzar is a bloody and mystical lesson where greatness and downfall intertwine in the dark mystery of power. Watch the full video. God will bless you. One quiet evening in the grand palace of the Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar stood on the high balcony, gazing out over the majestic walls and winding rivers. Everything before him was a perfect picture of wealth and power. No one can compare to me, he thought to himself, his heart full of pride. In his eyes, everything in this world was the result of his strength and superior wisdom. However, at that very moment, a strange dream came to him. This dream was not like the usual ones he experienced. It was a strange, ominous vision, filled with foreboding. Before his eyes stood a magnificent tree, rising high into the sky, its branches spreading wide and covering the earth. The tree was beautiful and full of life, but then suddenly it was chopped down, leaving nothing but a bare stump. When he woke up, Nebuchadnezzar felt an inexplicable sense of fear. This dream was unlike any he had ever had. He had summoned wise men and magicians, the ones who could interpret dreams. But none of them could provide a satisfactory explanation. They all shook their heads, unable to decipher the imagery of the fallen tree and the warning it carried. In his heart, a strange curiosity arose. Was this dream a warning from heaven? Or was it just a meaningless vision, an indistinct image that held no truth? Yet Nebuchadnezzar could not shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, a change that he could not control. Soon after the strange dream, Nebuchadnezzar began to feel the weight of uncertainty. Not just the dream, but his entire life seemed to be overwhelmed by an inexplicable sense of stagnation. Everything he touched seemed to bring disappointment. The Babylonian Empire, once so mighty, was now beginning to crumble in his heart. One rainy evening, as he sat in the palace, Nebuchadnezzar drifted into a vague slumber. But this time, his dream was unlike the others. Instead of images of trees, he saw a gigantic hand descending from the heavens, casting its shadow over his kingdom. The hand did not bring wrath or violence, but a cold, eerie presence. A voice echoed in his dream. It is time for you to recognize that you are not the highest. This was not the voice of a man. It was not the counsel of any earthly wisdom. It was a voice from heaven, from a power he could not comprehend. But this only fueled his arrogance further. King Nebuchadnezzar could not accept a world where he was not the center. He could not believe that any higher power could control his destiny, a man who had conquered all that no other king had. As time passed, King Nebuchadnezzar continued in his self-righteousness. His kingdom flourished, and he ruled with absolute authority. From his magnificent palace, he gazed upon the world with a prideful eye, as though his empire and his greatness could not be shaken. On one bright morning, Nebuchadnezzar stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the magnificent walls of Babylon, the tall towers and the busy streets full of carts carrying gold and silver. Everything was a testament to his might and power. He smiled in satisfaction, thinking to himself, "This is the great work of mine, the result of my wisdom and strength." But before he could finish his words, a cold, powerful voice echoed in his mind. This voice was not from any earthly source. It was an otherworldly presence pulling at his very consciousness, sweeping him into an awareness he could not avoid. "Only I am the Lord of all. You have grown too arrogant and forgotten that all power and glory come from me. You will learn this lesson in a way you cannot imagine." This voice was not a fleeting whisper, but a mighty presence suddenly crashing into his mind. Nebuchadnezzar felt fear rise within him, a fear he had never known, despite his many victories. But then he pushed that feeling away. "I am the king, and no one can make me kneel. This Babylonian empire is mine, and no one will take it from me," he told himself. At that moment, the strange dream he had experienced returned to his mind. The images of the great tree, the tree being felled, and the warning of living as a wild beast once again appeared. He knew that God was trying to warn him about his arrogance, but his belief in his own greatness was too strong. He refused to believe any warning. To him, he was invincible. Time passed, and King Nebuchadnezzar continued to live in his self-righteous pride. Babylon's empire grew stronger, and he continued to rule it with an iron fist. From his grand palace, he looked upon the world with eyes full of arrogance, as if the existence of his empire and his greatness could never be challenged. One day, as he stood on the balcony of the palace, gazing over his kingdom, he once again felt a strange sensation of suffocation. Everything he touched seemed to disappoint him. Babylon was still a mighty empire, but something in his heart had changed. No matter what achievements he had gained, it all seemed increasingly empty. On that fateful morning, Nebuchadnezzar felt something break inside of him. The dream had returned stronger, louder. The presence that had filled him with dread now rose within him with a final, undeniable truth. He was not in control. All the power you have will be taken from you, and you will become like one of the beasts of the earth. The voice repeated, this time louder, clearer. The vision came again, the giant tree being felled, reduced to a mere stump. And then the deafening silence. You will learn that I am the one who holds the reins of all kingdoms. But still, Nebuchadnezzar could not bring himself to believe. He pushed the words away, filled with stubborn pride. I will not be moved, he thought, clinging to his delusion of invincibility. One day, as Nebuchadnezzar sat upon his throne, his kingdom, once again seemingly at its height, something shifted inside him. Suddenly, his mind was overwhelmed by a powerful force. It was as though his very consciousness was swept away, and in that moment, he could no longer comprehend anything around him. The familiar world of his empire faded into nothingness. He no longer knew who he was or where he was. The magnificent towers, the bustling streets, the grand feasts, they all disappeared from his vision. All that remained was an overwhelming sense of isolation and confusion. He found himself wandering in the wild eating grass. Like the cattle, his senses dulled, his intellect lost. For days, weeks, perhaps even months, Nebuchadnezzar wandered unable to grasp his own identity. His hair grew long, like eagle feathers, and his nails turned into claws, just as the prophecy had foretold. The mighty king of Babylon, now reduced to nothing more than a beast lost in the wilderness of his own mind. He did not recognize himself. He was a shadow of the man he once was. Nebuchadnezzar was no longer the powerful king. He was a mere animal in the wilderness. Days blended into nights, and he no longer knew the difference. He ate grass like an animal. His body became rough and uncaring. He lost touch with time, and all he could do was wander aimlessly through the wilds. The once proud ruler of Babylon now lived in the shadows of his former self. Yet in this desolation, Nebuchadnezzar began to feel something stir within him. It was subtle at first, just a faint trace of thought, but it grew steadily stronger. I am nothing, he thought. What have I become? He started to remember the grandeur of his empire, but it felt like a dream from a distant past. He could hear the winds whispering to him, voices that reminded him of the warnings he had received before. They had been true. His pride had led him here to this place of loneliness and degradation. Finally, one day, as Nebuchadnezzar sat in the grass looking up at the sky, he felt a wave of clarity sweep over him. His mind began to return. The visions of the mighty tree, the voice from heaven, and the realization that his reign was nothing but a gift from God, all flooded back into his consciousness. In that moment, he understood the truth. I have been humbled. I have been made nothing. As Nebuchadnezzar's sanity slowly returned, he felt a deep shift within him. He was no longer the king of his empire. He was simply a man humbled before the Lord. His body healed, and his mind began to regain its clarity. But now there was no arrogance, no pride. He had learned the truth. All power came from God, and he was merely a servant in God's plan. His days of wandering were over. He had returned to himself, but he was no longer the same man who had ruled Babylon with such an iron fist. He had seen the darkness within his soul, and now he understood the importance of humility. Only God is sovereign, he whispered to himself as he knelt before the Creator, thanking him for the mercy shown. When Nebuchadnezzar finally regained his throne, the Babylonian Empire still stood, but it was no longer a symbol of his greatness. It was now a gift from God, entrusted to him temporarily. He was a steward of the kingdom, not its owner. He ruled with newfound wisdom, one that came from the depths of humility and understanding. He no longer viewed his power as something to be flaunted, but as a responsibility to be used in service of God's will. He knew that without God's blessing, his kingdom would fall, just as his own mind had once fallen. He looked out over his empire and knew that it was a fragile thing. It was only by God's grace that it had endured. With this new understanding, he ruled with mercy and wisdom, no longer driven by pride. As Nebuchadnezzar resumed his reign, he stood before his people and declared, "I am not the king because of my own strength, but because of God's grace. All power comes from the Most High, and I am but a servant in his kingdom." This declaration was not just for his people, but for himself, a final acknowledgement of God's authority and his place within God's plan. Nebuchadnezzar had been restored, but his kingdom was not restored to him because of his own greatness. It was restored because of God's mercy. He did not seek glory for himself, but instead sought to glorify the one who had allowed him to rule. Nebuchadnezzar, now a humble king, stood before the people of Babylon and proclaimed, "There is no king but God. He alone reigns supreme over all the kingdoms of the earth. I have learned that all power, all glory comes from him." And so Nebuchadnezzar's reign was marked not by arrogance, but by a deep, abiding humility. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that all things great and small are in the hands of God. His story became a testament to the greatness of God's sovereignty and the importance of humility in the face of divine power. The once proud king, now a humble servant, had seen the truth. To God be the glory forever and ever. As we've seen, the story of King Nebuchadnezzar reminds us that no matter how great we may become, it is humility and acknowledging God's supreme power that truly guides us. His transformation from pride to repentance is a powerful lesson for all of us. Remember, the greatest power lies not in our hands, but in surrendering to His will. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. May God continue to bless you and guide your journey.